Welcome, everyone. I'm Zoe Chan, curator at the Richmond Art Gallery, and I'm delighted that everyone could join us today. We'd love to hear where you're listening in from, if you want to let us know in the chat. And I see already that Su-Ying Lee, the curator of Amy's exhibition, is here today. So before we begin, I just wanted to mention that I'm broadcasting from Vancouver, which is located on the ancestral lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh nations. And speaking of colonization and its histories, colonialism and its links to theft and looting are just some of the themes that run through Amy Ching-Yan Lam's playful yet profound exhibition, A Small But Comfy House and Maybe a Dog. But before we delve into today's event, I'd just like to let you know how it will roll out. I'm going to briefly introduce our featured guests. Then Amy will say just a few words as to how she became interested in Dr. Sarah Chang's research. We'll then hear Dr. Cheang present on Pekingese dogs, dog breeding, and colonial trade. Amy will do a brief reading from her book, Looty Goes to Heaven, which I've got my copy. I've got my copy here. Followed by a conversation between Sarah and Amy. And then we'll conclude with a Q&A where you'll be invited to type your questions into the chat. And we want to be mindful of the time. We're actually all in different time zones today. I'm on the West Coast, of course. Amy's in Toronto, I think, right now. And Sarah's across the pond in London, so quite late. So we're probably aiming to wrap up here in a little over an hour. So now I'm just going to say a few words about our guests. So Amy is an artist who makes exhibitions, performances, and public artworks. And of course, she currently has her exhibition at the Richmond Art Gallery, which is up until June 11th. She was part of the duo Life of a Crabhead between 2006 and 2020. Lam has presented work at Eastside Projects, Seoul Media City Biennial, the Western Front here in Vancouver, Centre Clark in Montreal, and numerous other venues. She is a published author with books including, of course, Looty Goes to Heaven, which she'll read from today, and also her first full-length collection of poetry, Baby Book, which just came out this spring. Dr. Sarah Chang is head of program for History of Design at the Royal College of Art in London. Her research interests comprise global histories of fashion, the body, and Chinese material culture. And it's really, I love reading the list of all of the things she's written about: Chinese ceramics, garments, embroideries, wallpapers, carpets, Chinese hairstyles, pianos, and of course, the Pekingese dog. So yeah, delighted that you're both here. And I think I'll now hand the mic over to Amy.
Thank you, Zoe, and thank you everyone for coming, and Zoe for hosting this conversation. Yeah, I'm really happy to be able to introduce Sarah and to be in conversation with Sarah again, because when I first heard about the story of Looty, which was so fascinating, one of the very first things that I read was a paper that Sarah wrote that was published in 2006. And it's called Women, Pets, and Imperialism, the British Pekingese Dog and Nostalgia for Old China. And the story that Sarah laid out in this paper is so fascinating and was so full of, different paths that linked the dog to histories of colonialism and also femininity. And also serendipitously, it had this picture of an aristocratic woman holding a dog, which maybe I'll show later in the talk. But it just so happened that this aristocratic woman was also linked to this site that I had been researching in Birmingham in London, which was part of this other project I was doing there, which is where this Looty Goes to Heaven work comes out of. So there's this like very kind of lucky connection or strange connection, and then also this wild kind of field of possibility that Sarah opened up. And so, yeah, I'm really excited that Sarah is going to talk to us a bit about Pekingese dogs. And I guess I also want to say that I reached out to Sarah after reading the paper, and we had this amazing conversation that I think really sparked how I approached the project. And one of the most interesting things I remember Sarah telling me was, you know, this idea of Looty, this Pekingese dog, as being, she never had any children, so there's no lineage post Looty, and so she's kind of like this figure in history that's very separate and unique in a way, kind of disconnected from other things. And I think that's why, you know, just that the feeling of that really led to the development of this work. But yeah, Sarah, if you want to start.
Yeah, so I'll just share the screen for Sarah. Yeah, Sarah, I'll just ask you just to tell me when to change.
Thank you. Yes, I will use the code that we agreed earlier.
Great.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Zoe, and thank you, Amy. Yeah, I mean, the conversation that Amy and I had was so exciting for me as a historian to be talking to an artist who really got the idea of what Looty might represent, and there was so much more that we could talk about around that. So I'm going to talk a bit about the history of Looty the Pekingese. Before I do that, I need to thank the staff of the Kennel Club Library in London and the Kennel Club Art Collection for their assistance in the research that I conducted, both on Pekingese dogs and Chow dog history. And I can't thank the Royal Collections because I didn't approach them about any of this work, unlike Amy, who's much braver than I, and maybe Amy will talk a bit about that too later. So next slide, please.
There you go.
Okay, so what I'd like to do is talk about how we get from Looty, seen here in 1865, asleep on the chair, to the next slide, which is the Pekingese Club. I think it's kind of peak Pekingese hysteria, 1910s, 1920s, when the Pekingese dog was a really fashionable pet in Britain, certainly. And then to the next slide, please. And then to this moment where I found myself about a year ago in Birmingham in England with Amy, and this image is Amy reading her story to two Pekingese dogs. I think they were called Craig and Priscilla, if I remembered that right. Yeah, Craig and Priscilla, and they're there in front of an opium poppy. So to understand what brings all this, you know, why were we in Birmingham with two Pekingese dogs reading Amy's story with an opium poppy? To understand this, you have to know the last 300 years of the history of trade and diplomatic relationships between China and Britain. So that's where I'm going to start. And this is a story that these two dogs heard as well when we sat with the dogs in the gallery, and I told this story there. So, you know, I'm looking at their little faces, and they've heard this story now about the last 300 years of trade with Britain and China. So I'm going to do this very fast. So this is broad strokes. In the 18th century, Britain was in the grip of a kind of China mania. So Chinese things were really fashionable. Particularly if you were a wealthy elite, you wanted Chinese decoration everywhere. And if you weren't so wealthy, you might still be able to afford a single piece of blue and white porcelain, even if you weren't that wealthy. So everybody wanted Chinese porcelains and Chinese wallpapers, but it was particularly tea that the British were interested in. So there are a lot of nations trading at Canton, or Guangdong as we now say, but the British had the biggest warehouses on the waterfront, and that was because of the sheer amounts of tea that was being bought by the British. And the British are also industrializing at this point in history. Towards the end of the 18th century, the British have got lots of stuff that they want to sell to the world, and this is partly what's driving British colonial activities. So they want to sell, bizarrely, ceramics back to the Chinese, so coming out of factories like Wedgwood. They also want to sell textiles, so all the Manchester textiles that were being churned out of the factories. So they're trying to get permission to trade in China. They can't get permission. The emperor is not going to grant them trading rights in China because the Chinese trading system was very, the balance of power was very much on the side of the Chinese at this point in history in the 18th century. So the silver is leaving London in these huge ships and then being deposited in China, all the silver bullion, and the ships come back with all the tea and the textiles and the ceramics back to Europe. But the British are also very busy building an empire in South Asia. So in British India, the British start to establish tea plantations of their own. So they found a way to circumnavigate the China tea trade. And the other thing the British are doing there is growing opium. So they have huge opium plantations. And then this opium is smuggled illegally into China and sold in China. So this is British opium going into China. And at this point, opium consumption, opium trading was illegal in China. So the British are smuggling it in. Because it's illegal, it's beyond the control of the Chinese government. So the Chinese, they refuse to legalize the trade. And in fact, they try to stop it. And they even write to Queen Victoria to ask her to put a stop to it because it's bad for the health of the Chinese people. And it's making the British and also Americans a lot of money. So this all leads to a series of wars that were fought in China, which are known as the Opium Wars. And they're called the Opium Wars because they were fought for the right of the British to sell opium in China. It was the British government sending the military in to support the opium traders. So this is a series of armed conflicts that occurred in China between 1840 and 1842. That's known as the First Opium War. And then the second set of conflicts was 1856 to 1860. And China loses these wars and is forced to sign treaties that give the Western powers some territories in China. So a very obvious example is Hong Kong. Also, Westerners get the right to travel and trade in China. And this is seen as a very humiliating moment in Chinese history that forces a lot of change in China as well. Next slide, please. Thank you. So a key moment in the Opium Wars history is the sacking of the Summer Palace. It's like the conclusion, it's the last thing that happens in 1860, the end of the Opium Wars. Summer Palace, known also as Yuan, was a space that you actually used European style architecture and huge gardens. It's kind of like a Chinese Versailles. It's pleasure gardens for the Chinese imperial family. So the French and British troops loot this summer residence. It's kind of in the northern area of Beijing. They destroyed the buildings, they set fire to it. But before they set fire to it, they stole a lot of the contents. So this is looted treasures, looted things. And museums in France and Britain still contain a lot of it. Private collections still contain a lot of it. These are objects that are subject to demands for repatriation. Some things have made their way back to China, but there's still things that haven't. Next slide, please. So part of the loot that definitely made its way back to England very quickly was 5 Pekingese dogs, one of which was the famous dog Looty, who you see here in a portrait. So there are several stories about how, well, more than several, about how they were found. One story says they were found in the royal apartments of the palace by a group of British officers who'd gone into the palace to so-called see the sights. So there's almost like in the moment of this like war and looting, they were just having a little sightseeing tour around the palace. So this story goes that they go in there, they find these 5 dogs. And also they say that Looty was found inside a wardrobe. Actually, Looty may well have first been removed by the French troops and then passed to the British. Now, British sources have always portrayed the French as having been more frenzied and more destructive. So this is the British just criticising the French, perhaps. But also, it is true that the British had a much more established system for looting. And the British troops expected to get a share of the profits from looting the palace. So they would have gone into the palace with much more of an interest in trying not to destroy everything. They would have been maybe a little bit more careful because what they're picking up has clear, they're going to make money out of it. So according to James Heavier, who's a historian and expert on the history of looting in China, Heavier says that the French soldiers were allowed by their commanding officers to engage in really wild looting and destruction, and then they were encouraged to calm down by reminding them that, you know, everything that they'd taken, they just wouldn't be able to carry it back to France. So then, having encouraged them to think, oh my God, what am I going to do with all this stuff I've taken out of the palace? They were then given a chance to sell off their loot to the British soldiers and to the officers. And also there were a lot of private merchants who were there. So the French soldiers have got stuff and they're selling it to the British and to other people. So the British officers, this is where I think perhaps the stories are a bit dodgy. The British officers could have bought whatever they wanted at this point via the French. So Looty could well have been taken by the French and taken to the French camp and then sold to the British. So actually it can still be legitimately said that she was got straight from the palace looting, perhaps not as directly as a British officer going in and getting her out the wardrobe. So of the 5 dogs that went back to England, Lord John Hay took 2, Sir George Fitzroy took 2, and those 4 in total were passed to other members of the British aristocracy, and they start trying to breed with them. But they're really more of a curiosity. Sorry, that sounded like the people are breeding with the dogs. I mean, they try to use the dogs to breed more dogs, but they're more of a curiosity than a foundational breeding stock. There's not enough dogs there to really create a viable breeding stock. They may well be trying to crossbreed them with Japanese spaniels and so on, but generally speaking, there's not enough. The 5th one, General Dunn took from the Summer Palace 5, christened her Looty and presented her to Queen Victoria, which is what Amy's work has been all about. Now Looty lived in the kennels at Windsor Castle, and it appears that Queen Victoria didn't really interact with her or take much notice of her, and she died there in 1872. Next slide, please. That's not the end of the story of looted dogs though and British colonial violence. So the Pekingese dog continues to be associated with acts of smuggling and the acquisition of Chinese treasures by stealth and by bribery and by deception from this point 1860 right through until the sort of, you know, early 1900s. So this is a taxidermied Pekingese dog, a very early version. It looks very different to the dogs we see today. He's called, unfortunately named Cum, which I think is a little bit of an unfortunate name, is one of a number of Chinese Pekingese that were acquired by British breeders during the 1890s. And Cum was said to have been smuggled out of the Forbidden City, hidden in a crate, along with other crates of wild animals. And he's really seen as a patriarch of the breed in England. That's why he's been stuffed. He died in 1905 when he was presented to the Natural History Museum in London, as he's a historic, important dog in terms of the foundation of the breed. Next slide, please. So, for example, if we look at the pedigree of a dog called Broad Oak Beetle, so you can, it's another strange name. You can see that I found a little picture of Broad Oak Beetle, which is up on the top left there. So you have to read, well, it depends which way you want to go in time, really. But if you want to start at the earliest point, you have to read from the right to the left. And so these are all the ancestors, as it were, of Broad Oak Beetle. And you can see the top name there is Cum. So this is his place in the terms of the breeding of champions. This is a Broad Oak Beetle's a champion dog, won Crufts twice and many other competitions as well. And you see it says Cum imported 1896. So, and that implies this is a dog that's come directly from apparently a Chinese palace. Some other important names here, you can see Peking Peter, imported 1893. Peking Peter was bought from a Shanghai taxidermist and was said to have been stolen from a palace. So there's no evidence for that, but he was said to have been stolen from a palace. And then there's 2 others there, Peking Prince and Peking Princess. There's a bit of a clue in their names. They were also said to have been stolen from a palace in 1896. So these are all dogs that were smuggled out or somehow got by stealth. And the most important thing about them is the idea of these royal associations and their palace origins. By 1905, there's enough of a breeding stock to support a Pekingese dog in Britain. 1904, the Pekingese Club was formed in the UK. New kennel club registrations jumping up from this point. By 1914, the Pekingese is the most popular pedigree toy dog in Britain, and it stayed at the top of the toy dog charts until 1962, when it was outstripped by the Yorkshire Terrier. So the Pekingese basically is the dog of choice if you want a pedigree toy dog from 1914 right through to the 1960s. Could I have the next slide, please? So what should they look like? What were breeders trying to do when they were breeding the dogs? I've mentioned that they might have been crossbreeding with Japanese Spaniels, and in general there was a real rush to cash in on these newly popular and fashionable dogs. And there were concerns that the breed was losing its proper in inverted commas Chinese characteristics. So one of the things the breeders started to do was look at Chinese art to figure out what a Pekingese dog should look like. And in 1908, a new Pekingese club was formed called the Peking Palace Dog Association. And the Peking Palace Dog Association, first of all, they're clearly trying to reinforce the idea that dogs have come out of palaces, and they want to track back, first of all, to the earlier dogs. Secondly, they want to breed dogs that look like appropriately Chinese objects, and the object they seize upon is the Chinese Buddhistic lion. So you can see here a book from 1909, and on the front cover there's a ceramic Chinese lion, and what the breeders want to do is breed their Pekingese dogs to look like this lion. There's a lot of reasons for that, which I won't go into now, but what I think is interesting is that if you look, there's a medallion at the top right corner from the Pekingese Club, which is just a cute little dog, and then the bottom left is the Peking Palace Dog Association logo, which is very clearly something very stylized, alluding to a different kind of history perhaps. And if you go to the next slide, we've got some better pictures. Yeah, so here we've got Pekingese Club and Peking Palace Dog Association medals. The Pekingese Club also start adopting the Chinese Buddhistic lion as the symbol of their club and the model to which you should breed. Peking Palace Dog is even more extreme, perhaps. Next slide, please. And this association of Pekingese dogs with the Chinese lion even extends to dog biscuit adverts. So this says, feed your Pekingese on Sprat's toy pet biscuits and watch the Chinese type develop. And in the picture, they've actually jammed a dog biscuit into the mouth of a piece of Chinese art. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Right, so the breed's utterly associated with stealing from palaces and ideas about it being a very Chinese kind of object. And Looty's fame has really lived on. For example, for non-doggy people, Looty's name and her presence at the sacking of the Summer Palace has led to another kind of attention in relation to the very pressing and important need to decolonize museums and many other cultural institutions. So these are screenshots from the Looty repatriation project. Can I have the next slide? So this is a group of artists, thinkers, philosophers who are looking at restitution in a very different way. They're proposing a different approach to restitution. They don't focus on China specifically, but they've taken the name Looty for the project. Next slide, please. And they certainly are using Looty. We could say that Looty has been their muse, let's put it that way. So if Looty is like a muse for thinking now about colonialism, about repatriation. Next slide. Just got one more bit to go. So before I end, I just wanted to share one more small piece of history. The Windsor Kennels were set up in 1840. They housed about 100 dogs, of which Looty was just one. And not many of them were favoured enough to be allowed into the house like these ones. So we can imagine that Looty never got to roll around perhaps on this carpet quite like these other dogs. But the thing I wanted to say actually was that Looty was not the first Chinese dogs to have been housed at the Windsor Kennels. Next slide, please. So in 1846, there's a list was published of all the dogs in the Windsor Home Park Kennel. And it actually includes a category called Chinese dogs. And under Chinese dogs, there are 3 animals listed. And there's a note next to them, that one of them that says, from Colonel Malcolm. And it seems very likely that at least one of them would have been a Chinese Chow Chow. And Chow Chow dogs at this time were known in England as the Chinese edible dog. So who was Colonel Malcolm, and why might these Chinese dogs have been in the Windsor kennels? George Alexander Malcolm was born in Bombay. He was the son of the British governor of Bombay. He went to China in 1841 during the First Opium War. He went with Henry Pottinger, who became the first governor of Hong Kong. At the conclusion of the First Opium War, when the Treaty of Nanking was signed in September 1842, so that's when Hong Kong was ceded to the British, Colonel Malcolm took the treaty that had been signed in Nanking, he took it and he ran as fast as possible onto a steamer and went as fast as possible on the steamer to London immediately to Queen Victoria for her to ratify the treaty. So in the days, this is in the days where you couldn't get on a plane or send it by email. So, and she's got to sign it. What I want to say is it not possible that he also took a Chinese dog or 2 with him and presented them to Queen Victoria? Last slide, please. In 1894, Chows were the first Chinese breed to be fully recognised by the Kennel Club in Britain. So the Chow Chow Club was formed in 1895. This is 11 years before the Pekingese Club. My question is, was there also an earlier incarnation of Looty already at Windsor Castle in the 1840s, equally as neglected both as a pet and as breeding stock, and what was her story? Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was really fascinating, and I wish we could just hear you talk more about this. Yeah, just incredible to be thinking about Looty as a symbol of colonization and its methods, and how you said of stealth, bribery, and deception, and how its ramifications are still being felt today. Yeah, very interesting about the it's becoming a symbol of repatriation too. Now I'm gonna I'm sure there's lots more to say, but I'll let Amy do her reading from her book, inspired by just sort of an imagined subjectivity of Looty and its life and death. So over to you, Amy.
Very cool, thank you. I'm just gonna start maybe by introducing about how this or I wanted to introduce the painting that Sarah showed of Looty. One of the works that's in the show at the gallery is this rejection letter, where we tried to borrow that painting of Looty from the Royal Collection, and we asked for it quite early on, like in 2021 or something. And then the Royal Collection sent us this very polite rejection letter saying that we cannot borrow it. So this is a photo of the rejection letter that's in the show, and you can see that it's addressed to Mr. Dacey, who's the director of the gallery, and that they're sure that the exhibition is going to be fascinating and thought-provoking, but they cannot loan the painting. And so in the show, there's this rejection letter. There's also an animation that I made with my friend Emerson Maxwell of Looty. And then there's also this publication that I wrote, which is called Looty Goes to Heaven. And so I'm going to read for about 15 minutes from it. And I'll read a bunch of different sections from various places in the book so that, yeah, you can have a sense of the story. And it is fictional, but parts of it, I mean, the story itself is based on this real historical event, and there's details in it that I took from histories that I read. So the paper that Sarah wrote, and also the historian James Hevia that she mentioned. But it's not all true, obviously. So I'm going to start with a passage from the beginning. And the story takes place mostly at the gate to heaven. So Looty has died and she's landed at this place, which is the gate to heaven. The gate to heaven was a perfectly round hole in a thicket of thorny bushes. There was only one small twig that disturbed the perfect circle. Looty started moving closer, but a person wearing a tall silk hat with 2 quivering antennae stepped out of the hole. They snipped the twig with a pair of shining scissors. Then the person turned to look at her. A very flat, round, green face was surrounded by long, black, messy hair. Crimson eyes pointed down at a low, round nose with big nostrils. The hat's antennae left faint, glowing trails in the air as they waved. Looty yelped, and in making the noise, realized that she was now a kind of cloud. She felt sensitive all over, like her whole body was a nose. She could feel her yelp reverberate through the air, which was also her body, and it was both pleasurable and scary. The green-faced person, without taking their red eyes off of Looty, began to rummage through their many pockets, shrugging their arms in and out of many different sleeves. It seemed like their robe had an infinite number of sleeves and pockets, covered in many tiny patches stitched evenly by hand. Inside some of the pockets were nuts, others had needles and bundles of thread, others had miniature light bulbs, and others had rolled up scrolls. Looty, to her embarrassment, started whining. The green-faced person brought their finger up to their mouth and went, shh. Their voice was low and gravelly, and the sound rippled through Looty. They said, "The other name for heaven is hell." Then they pulled out a scroll that was tied with a stained baby blue ribbon and tugged it loose. The scroll unfurled towards Looty, one end coming to rest exactly in front of Looty's paw, making it tingle. And then I'm just skipping ahead a little bit to this part where Looty's at the Chinese palace, at the summer palace. Back then, Looty's name was not Looty, it was Flowerbud, but Looty didn't like it. She felt it was only assigned to her because of the rule that all the dogs were to be named after beautiful, precious things. Moon said, "I think it suits you, but what would you prefer instead?" "I don't know, what about Stinky Wind Tormentor?" Looty replied. Moon, who's this other dog who's the lover and best friend of Looty, laughed because Stinky Wind was what all the dogs called the emperor. His rich meals made him constantly gassy, which he tried to hide with perfume, and he was full of fake affection. The dogs would mentally prepare themselves whenever he entered their rooms. During one of his visits, he cooed extravagantly over Moon, which gave her the excuse to follow him around, jumping up and biting his face over and over until he couldn't keep up the pretense anymore and had to throw Moon off of him in disgust. Moon then skipped around the room, licking her lips with great relish and making eye contact with the other dogs, really stretching her tongue out to make them laugh, until one of them, Cinnabar, lost control of her bladder in a delirium. Moon got away with doing stuff like that because she was a breeding dog. She had fur on her ears that reached all the way down to the floor, while Looty's stopped growing after a certain length. She was constantly being fed different meal plans and fed a new plan and measured again. The caretakers were especially obsessed with assessing her shit. They would pick it up constantly and peer into it like they were looking for messages. Moon's first litter was the easiest and her fourth the hardest. The dog caretakers removed 2 out of the 5 puppies from the fourth because they deemed them to be weak. Moon cried for days afterwards, a cry that was small and high-pitched. Each of Moon's living 28 children were given official nicknames, and Looty and Moon also gave them nicknames that were more appropriate for their generally annoying personalities. The 4 that died were named secretly by Moon. She didn't tell anyone else their names. Chapter 4. The day that the British and French troops broke into the palace, Looty and Moon had been hiding for several weeks already. The emperor had left for the season a few months ago as usual, but then almost all of the attendants and caretakers disappeared one day as well. Most of them took dogs along with them to sell, including all of Moon's children. There were only a couple of guards left, and they were not so much patrolling as nervously darting around the grounds, whispering theories about why the barbarians were so touchy. One caretaker who was devoted to the dogs stayed behind and put food out for them, but there was less of it every day. "When do you think we should go?" Looty asked. "So we are going to the village," Moon replied. Their quiet arguing was interrupted by loud laughter and the stomping of boots down the hall. The laughter and stomping paused in front of the library, and the vase at the entrance clattered to the floor. A strange metallic smell filled the air. Moon and Looty stopped breathing. After a moment, the boots moved away, but then in their bellies, they felt the distant vibration of many more boots. Looty looked at Moon to see what to do. She understood Moon's expression, saying, "It's going to be okay. We have to go. Let's go now." Moon darted out from the bookcase and Looty followed, and they ran as fast as they could out from the library, down the hallway, towards the gardens, towards the exterior walls. As they were running through the courtyard, Looty spotted the caretaker, her clothing all disheveled and eyes wild, running towards them. She hesitated, which made Moon slow down too. When Moon saw Looty looking at the caretaker, she cried no, but Looty's hesitation allowed the caretaker to catch up. The caretaker looked at them both and decided to make a grab for Moon. She managed to get a hold of Moon's tail and lift her up, Moon screaming. Then Looty saw Moon struggling in the caretaker's arms, and then the caretaker sprinting towards the gates to a meeting hall, and then appearing from around a corner, a tall man in a red jacket and white pants chasing the two of them. Looty stayed frozen underneath the Emperor's bed beside the piss pot, her mind completely blank, ruled by nothing, until she was dragged out by her hind legs. The man in the red jacket who pulled her out chuckled and gripped her tightly in his arms, his metallic smell suffocating. He marched her past the rooms of the palace, in which at least half of everything had been smashed and laid in bits on the floor. She was brought outside to one of the great halls, where there were a swarm of men in red jackets, a couple of them standing on top of a lacquer table, beside a giant pile of unsmashed things: screens, chairs, wall hangings, sculptures, furs, scrolls, jars, jewelry, bolts of silk, all the things that represented power and mastery. The incense burner that shaped smoke into 1,000 twirling strands, a book of paintings on silk depicting scenes from a play about a love affair at the end of a dynasty, maybe the Celtisphere, even a clock that had been gifted to the emperor by a British lord. All of it was now this heap, about to be dissolved into cash. To celebrate, some of the red-jacketed men had wrapped furs around their necks and were dancing and waggling their arms. Others were pointing and clapping along. Someone called out to the man who was clutching her, "I bid 500 for the dog, haha." The man holding Looty snorted and kept walking. A bowl fell off someone's head and bounced once on the floor. And I'm skipping ahead a little bit again. Back at the gate to heaven, Looty watched a hedgehog waddle its way through the hole in the thicket. Before she could go in, she had to give the green-faced person a true account of her life. The green-faced person said, in their gravelly voice, "It can be as short or as long as you like. The only condition is that it must be absolutely true." The green-faced person said, "True in the sense that it is what will be forgotten. Once it is written down on the scroll, then you will forget it." The antennae on their hat gave a tiny wave at the conclusion of this statement. "Or actually, we will all forget it. I will forget it too," they added. Looty watched a white rat, 3 millipedes, a hairless cat, a pufferfish, and now this hedgehog, all in the form of shivering clouds, give their true accounts, while she sat there, stuck. It seemed very unfair that she had to determine at this moment what her account would be, when so many other things in her life had been determined for her, and that it would all be forgotten, and also that there was no one else here to help her remember or forget, when how could anything be remembered or forgotten without someone else? And what if she left something or someone out of this true and final account? Would that something or someone be lost forever? Would the something or someone she left out be so lost that the effects would travel through time to hurt or diminish what she could not remember in this moment? And to make it even worse, everyone had started the true account of their life with their true name, and she did not think that hers was either Looty or Flowerbud. The green-faced person watched the back of the hedgehog until it disappeared entirely into the thicket and said, "You can keep thinking about it for a little while longer, but you can't stay here forever." The green-faced person sat down on the worn dimple of a rock. They pulled out a nut from one of their pockets and started nibbling on it, and rifled through another sleeve until they found a small, salmon-colored plastic clock. They turned its dials with their long fingers while holding it in the same hand, narrowing their eyes to make sure the time was correct. And then this is the last scene that I'll read. It's a scene where now Looty is in England and she's at Windsor Castle. The next time Looty met the Queen was at a special tea with the Queen's daughter-in-law, the princess, some consorts, and a visiting gentleman from China who had been presented to the royals as a Mandarin, but was actually an opium trader. He had helped make some British opium traders, and in the process himself, very rich. The servants laid out a spread of tea, sandwiches, and cakes, and put a little red bow on the top of Looty's head and a couple of jingling bells around her neck. She was brought into the room on a little pillow of yellow silk, which had been custom made for her out of silk taken from the first palace, and everybody smiled when she entered. The caretaker presented her first to the Chinese man. In his lap, Looty could tell that he wasn't especially interested in her. His body was alert and aimed towards the Queen, but he still made a show of saying "good doggy" in English and then in Cantonese. The Queen murmured appreciatively at the foreign language. Then he passed her to the princess, who exclaimed, "Poor thing, what a sweet little thing," and pet her all over, kissing her nose over and over. "She must be so lonely, coming from so far away." The princess started asking the Chinese man a series of questions about the Pekingese breed. What were they fed at the palace? What gave them their special walk? Was only the emperor allowed to touch them? Was anyone else outside of the royal palace allowed to buy or breed them? At first, the opium trader didn't know what to say. He hadn't been expecting an interrogation about small dogs. On his way over, he actually had been worrying about using the correct English word for foreigner. The Chinese character that meant both foreigner and barbarian had been outlawed by the British in China, so he wasn't sure what was acceptable in English, and he was scared he'd use an inappropriate word in front of the Queen, revealing himself. But seeing the greedy interest in the princess's face and the corresponding disinterest in the Queen's, he quickly realized that he could say anything he wanted about dogs, so he talked for as long as he could, repeating the few things he had heard about the emperor's pets and fluffing them up with anecdotes about other random dogs he had met throughout his life. He mixed up imperial decrees with dog personalities, Manchu traditions with basic pet care until he confused himself. Thankfully, he had a story saved for the end of his rambling, one he had heard before, about how the Pekingese was the result of a lion falling in love with a marmoset. The Buddha had granted the lovers their wish by shrinking the lion down to the marmoset's size. The opium trader added, "The Buddha didn't make the marmoset lion-sized because the rest of the animals thought, and the Buddha agreed, that it would be too creepy." This last tale pleased the princess so much, she gave Looty another long kiss on the forehead and said, "It would be so cute if she had a little husband with her own little family." Looty, for the most part, had been looking at a tapestry hanging on the wall that had a dragon flying through one corner of the sky. The dragon was rainbow colored, with a long tail that looped around itself and ended in a curlicue. Its back was arched, its teeth bared, its chin and nose hairs streaming in the wind. It looked like it was flying up directly towards the edge of the tapestry to break through the surface between the picture and the room. But when the princess said family, Looty reflexively dug her nails into the princess's thighs, which made the princess nearly drop her cup of tea. She then pinched Looty hard, which made Looty squeal and jump out of her lap directly onto a platter of prune cakes. The nasty cakes squished between her toes, and she hopped out of them onto a consort's lap, knocking over the tower of liver pate and sweet pickle sandwiches, which fell onto the giant teapot, making it crash to the floor. The consort let out a guttural yell and shoved Looty off of her taffeta skirts, and Looty landed belly up in the slurry of sugar, liver, and tea that oozed a path across the floor. The queen pretended like nothing had happened, and the Chinese visitor tried to follow suit, but his face showed that he hoped what the Chinese dog had done wouldn't be used against him later. The princess was furious for a moment, but then said, "Of course, she's not properly trained." And as the servants rushed in to clean up and remove Looty, she asked the opium trader, "Could you find me a stud so I can have some of my own?" After the tea, Looty was sent by the queen to live with the princess at a different palace. And that's it.
Thank you, Amy. Yeah, I'm looking forward to hearing more about how you came up with this idea. But I'll let you and Sarah. We thought we'd take some time for you both to discuss a bit.
Yeah.
About your respective interests.
Yeah. Sarah, do you want to start?
Okay, well, I love hearing you read that story.
Thank you.
I was thinking a lot about, well, I was thinking of a lot of things, but I wanted to start maybe with that lovely line about true in the sense that it is what will be forgotten. I mean, to me, that says so much about the way that these stories are seized upon or forgotten, but also the idea that maybe that there's a kind of truth that you're getting at that's not in these other accounts through thinking so much about the experience of this dog. So I wonder if you wanted to say a bit more about what you were thinking when you wrote that line.
Yeah, I guess, what happens in the story is that Looty, like I read, she's kind of stuck at the gate to heaven because she has to give this story of her life and she can't do it. Like she doesn't know what her name is. She doesn't know what to say. She just feels this problem of trying to commit something to paper. And I feel like that is something that I identify with a lot in terms of not necessarily maybe even writing about my own life, but reading other people's memoirs or biographies or reading representations of other people and beings, right? Is like, okay, there's this one representation by a person and it comes from a perspective, and that's just such a tiny slice of it. It's such a, like just a fragment of what the reality of the experience is. And I guess that's what kind of Looty is like stuck with. And then I think that when the green-faced person who's kind of like this bureaucrat, right? Like this is like a kind of Chinese bureaucrat at the gate to hell or gate to heaven or whatever, gives her as kind of an out, because they say like, don't, in a certain way, they're saying like, don't worry about it so much. Like no one's going to remember anyway. Like, why are you like freaking out and like trying to come up with this like perfect story when no one's going to remember? And I don't know, to me, that just felt kind of freeing for Looty. Like I kind of see it as this way where it's like, okay, like, you don't have to worry so much about creating this perfect representation, because your life or your experience is something that exists outside of the representation. And so even though Looty, as we know it, like for me, it's like kind of what's tragic a little bit about Looty is that she's the symbol for so many things. She's a symbol of looting, of colonialism, of this violence and destruction. And then on the flip side, she's also a symbol for like, in some ways of like, like these famous objects from the Summer Palace that were stolen, and the kind of national story in China of the Summer Palace, and like, yeah, the power and the glory of that time. But what I wanted to do in the story was see Looty as this person who's, or as a person, as a dog. This reminds me of when you said like the people and the dogs were breeding. Yeah. But as this being who's like outside of these realms of power, right? Like outside of the Chinese emperor, and also doesn't want to have anything to do with the queen. And like, and these are the stories that, yeah, are forgotten and you know, not recorded. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, yeah. I was also really struck in relation to that by the little bit about the true names, the names and the true names, what she was called, what she wanted to be called, what she didn't like being called, and then being given another name. Who knows their true name. And I was really thinking about this in relation to colonialism and migration and assimilation. I mean, recently I was asked to give the you know, how do I write my name in Chinese, because and normally I just don't, but there's a piece I wrote about a Chinese intellectual called Jiang Yi, who was traveling in Britain and America actually in the mid 20th century, and it was published recently by Hong Kong University Press, and there's going to be a Chinese version. And so the translator asked me how to write my name, and you know, this presents me with a bit of a challenge. I know what my family name looks like in Chinese. There's two different versions depending on whether we're using traditional simplified form, of course, but I realized I didn't really know how to write my first name. There's a version of my name which is just phonetically Salah, which has been used in the past when I've been in China, but that's not my name, because I have a Chinese name, it's Ga Yi. But I don't know how to write it in Chinese, and when I told him, he didn't know, because he's not a Cantonese speaker, and then I have a piece of calligraphy which my grandfather did with my name, but no one seems to be able to decipher some of the characters he's put, so that it's a mystery, and it's a mystery that's partly it's very linked to my own family history and my father's desire to assimilate into British society, and also his own internalized feelings about what it is to be Chinese in British Hong Kong growing up there, and many other things as well, and where you place how important it is to be able to speak and write your own name. You know, so I hear some of Looty's story in that way, perhaps particularly at the moment because I've been wrestling about my name. I don't know if that resonates.
Yeah, totally. I mean, yeah, like my mom, I think lots of people, like growing up in Hong Kong, my mom got to pick her own English name, right? Like, and that was something that she got to do. And I find that so interesting. Like, there's this kind of magical power of names, right? Like that a name is like given to someone, or, you know, like in the beginning, like God made the world and God had these words or whatever, you know, and there's that kind of power. And then there's something interesting in being able to pick your own name. And then like what you're saying, to have a name that can't necessarily be deciphered in an easy way. Yeah. And I guess for me, like in writing, I also just didn't want to give Looty a name. Like I couldn't give Looty a definitive name because I don't know what it is, you know? So I kind of gave her one, but then I'm like, I don't know, like maybe that's not, there's kind of like, that's why Looty doesn't like it, because Looty, you know, I feel like Looty has her own name that I can't access, you know? Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Can I ask Sarah about sort of the practices of dog breeding sort of before the sort of looting processes of the British? Did they change at that point? Or you talked a lot about how they're linked to, you know, there was the importance of making sure that they were linked to having this kind of royal lineage, and that kind of thing. But has that always been the case with dog breeding in England, or what was it like in China? Yeah.
I mean, okay. Well, kind of disclaimer, first of all, I've not done in-depth research into a lot of other breeds, so it might be that there's, obviously I immediately think, oh, there's a King Charles Spaniel, isn't there? Maybe that's something there, but I don't think there is. I do think that the Pekingese dog is unique in its connection to royalty and the idea of the palace. I really do, because all the different dog breeds, a lot of them have really powerful associations with nationality. And you only have to look at the name changes. So the German Shepherd becomes the Alsatian during wartime, because things that are German are not popular in Britain and so in America. So yeah, there's it's the really associated with nationality, and it's also a way of, and then people project onto the dogs become representatives of the people of those countries. So another thing that we could talk about in relation to the Pekingese is the way in which they were said to both be like little tiny mandarins, little tiny Chinese officials, and they were also said to have this a kind of like a race memory, that they could remember somehow, even though they were 40 generations away from the palace, they somehow could remember having been in the palace, and they retained certain characteristics of a palace dog. They would instinctively do things because they remembered what it was like living in the palace. So there's a lot of myth making around, and it's all very tied to the idea of that the dog is not just any old Chinese thing. It's an animate thing that has memories, it has personality, it has behaviors. So I think that probably holds true for all the different dog breeds. And then the other thing is about when they're breeding to, what should the dog look like? All the different dog breeds have their clubs and they have their standards. So there's a rule book of what the dog has to look like in order to be considered a good example of that breed. And those are drawn up and deliberated over, and each country has its own set of rules as well. So the Chow Chow dog rules standard will be very similar to the British one, but it might differ in some wording and so on. But to get back to your question, I think that the Pekingese dog stories are very unique. And the Chow Chow doesn't have these palace connections at all in its stories or in its breeding. Has a different set of associations, actually to do with Buddhist temples. So it still has this Buddhistic line connection, but not this idea of royalty. No.
So there's kind of a fetishization of that royalty and sort of an appropriation for to validate British taste or something like that.
Indeed, and it's utterly bound up in this moment of high imperialism, that high Victorian imperialism.
Yeah, I was wondering, Sarah, if you could talk a bit more about like this idea of like the pets, like the craze of having dogs as pets at that moment in time, and how that might relate to the breeding part of it, like, and what you showed, those pictures of the women with all of their dogs, like what that kind of signified.
Yeah. Well, I mean, obviously lap dogs have a long history. So the pug is a really good example of actually originally another Chinese dog, but it came out of China very early, and then it sort of comes then via continental Europe to Britain and loses all its Chinese associations, but actually originally probably another Chinese dog. But the pug is an example of a little lap dog that was very popular, 100, 200 years before the Pekingese. So the lap dogs have always been a thing, but the Pekingese dog fashion was just extraordinary. If you look at any fashion imagery, particularly in the 1920s. There's so often a little Pekingese dog in the background. When you see pictures of whether they're satirical or serious, whenever you see pictures of fashionable women in the 1920s, they're very often accompanied by a Pekingese. There's the symbol of being fashionable at that moment. Yeah, and they're a great size, because you can, if you think that women are riding around in cars and even flying airplanes and have a bit more of an obviously active life. I think Victorian women were also quite active. They were always galloping about on horses, but in the 1920s, there's more of a sort of visual culture that's celebrating the freedom of the new woman. And those dogs are great to tuck it under your, put it in your arms, tuck it under your arm, take it anywhere. So they're very handy. They also go very nicely with the fashions for fox fur stoles. So it's very fashionable to have a big furry collar. There's a wonderful picture I had in my slides of a woman with a furry coat, and then she's holding two Pekingese dogs, and they look like they're a big furry collar. But having big pieces of fur on you was a really popular look, very fashionable in the 1920s, and so they go with that too. I'd say it's like a kind of really perfect accessory. It makes sense. But also there was 1920s a real high point for, there was a new wave of what's often termed chinoiserie, sort of Western version of Chinese things, and that was really at a peak in the 1920s as well. So the Pekingese dog, in terms of its arrival in Britain and its build as a breed, predates that moment. But my goodness, it's there ready for when Chinese things become really fashionable again in the 20s. So yeah, and then you can easily buy one. The other thing I wanted to say actually is that women are making a lot of money. Women are really prominent in the kennel breeding circles. So they're making they can make huge amounts of money. It's jobs for women.
Like breeding and selling dogs?
Up a kennel and selling dogs, yeah.
I'm just going to see if there are any questions from our guests today. Yeah. Well, maybe loved hearing about the history and Looty's fictional story. Thanks for taking the time to share your expertise, and from reading excerpts from your book, Sarah and Amy. Fascinating. Why did they call the chow dog edible?
Oh, I can tell you. Oh dear. Well, they were. I mean, they have been eaten historically. They were known as a dog that in China was used for meat and for fur. So unfortunately, it's not very nice, but it's the case. So yeah, though, so the word, the name Chow actually comes from Pidgin English. So the kind of weird mix up of Chinese and English and other languages that became known as Pidgin English, that was used by the British in their empire to communicate with people. Chow meant food, so it literally, the chow is like the food dog. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how the names, like the Pekingese dog, for example, it just really tells of its history. We're not going to say the Beijing, you know what I mean, dog, or it just is, it's just become so normalized, and we still say it today.
Yes, we can't now call it the Beijinger dog, can we? That wouldn't work. Yeah. In 1905 there was a dog show in London, and these women, the Ladies Kennel Association, they managed to get hold of a Chinese diplomat from Beijing to come and judge the dogs, because they assume he's going to naturally know what the best Chinese dogs are, and he has absolutely no idea what the best dog's going to be. But the great thing is when they write about him, he's the Pekingese judge, but he's judging the Pekingese dog, so they keep referring to him as the Pekingese judge because he's a Pekingese man from Peking. But it's this changeability between the Pekingese judge and the Pekingese dogs and the judging of the Pekingese. It's a very diplomatic, was a moment of immense diplomatic awkwardness, because he's had like the opium trader in your story. He's in with all these aristocratic British women, and he's got to play the Chinese man and be the expert with the dogs, whilst not, I'm sure, knowing nothing about the dogs. And the women are really not agreeing with his choices, but they can't be seen to be disagreeing with him because he's the authentic Chinese judge. So they're having to try and subtly influence his decisions on which is going to be the prize-winning dog, but without looking like they are.
Yeah. That scene in my book is totally based on that story. It's like a version of that story. It's like someone having to be the judge of something that they don't necessarily, be an expert of something that they're not necessarily an expert in.
Yeah. And maybe we've all been there at some point where you have to represent something authentic.
Let's see. Oh, there's a question about whether you have a Pekingese dog, Sarah.
No, I have a stuffed one, not real stuffed, not taxidermy. I have a vintage toy one, but I don't have a real one. I have a cat.
I wasn't sure because there was that photo that you showed during your presentation with the two dogs on the book.
Amy, you can talk about Craig and Priscilla.
When I was doing, so I launched this book in England, in Birmingham, and I went to I looked specifically for Pekingese dogs, and so I found someone who had two of them, and they brought their dogs to the event. But maybe I can show this picture of this. I went to a dog show, a Pekingese dog show in England. And so this picture is from, like, I guess 2021. And I was just really struck by going to this Pekingese dog show because they had, sorry, I'm having a, I don't know why I just did that. They had all of this like Chinese paraphernalia, like quote unquote Chinese paraphernalia to this day. It's like, whatever, like over 100 years later, and it still has all this like imagery and stuff associated with it to convey this feeling of authenticity or something. But then of course these Pekingese dogs like look totally different from what Looty looked like.
Right, I'm just now seeing like the little lanterns.
And you can't see, but at the front, the table, there's like all, like chopstick font and like all kinds of stuff.
Okay. Oh my gosh. Okay. Okay, well, maybe we'll end there, but I wanted to thank both of you. It was really interesting. Amy, I love the idea of you just delving into that active imagination of delving into Looty's experience, and even in the animation in the exhibition of sort of giving it another life, a sort of eternal life almost through this looped animation. And Sarah, once again, like really fascinating history, and now I want to find out more. I want to continue reading about that. Thank you so much. Thank you for staying up a bit later to do this with us. It was really wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you for having me.
And I just want to tell everyone too that there's still time to see Amy's exhibition, which is currently up at the Richmond Art Gallery up until June 11th, and the gallery is open every day. So we hope to be able to host you. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye. Bye.